No flash photography.
Now.
No flash photography, please. Please and thank you.
Welcome. I am the Gatekeeper of Washington Cemetery. This burial ground was created in 1842 and is the final resting place for hundreds of Washington, Connecticut residents for the past 2 centuries. This is the time of year where we honor those who have passed. During All Hallows Eve, the line between the living and the dead is at its thinnest, and they return to Earth. Tonight, you will hear women and men of Washington's past. They have returned to Earth to tell you their true stories. Some fascinating, some sad, and some tragic, but learn their lessons well. You may now enter the cemetery. Be sure to follow your tour guide and stay close to the light. You never know what will be lurking in the darkness.
Okay. Look, I'll tell you the same thing I told the police. I didn't murder the Smith brothers. George and David Smith were my friends. We were investment brokers together, and we had traveled to Muskogee, Oklahoma in April of 1930 to look in on a failed business venture, the Milford Securities Corporation. It had gone bankrupt. My name is Powell, Seeley, and we had traveled to Muskogee and we were staying in a suite at the Seavers Hotel. There were 4 of us staying there. The Smith brothers, George and David, and my other friend, David Wyke. He was on the board of the Securities Corporation. So they were in the living room, and I went into the bathroom to have a shave. So I was in having a shave, and I heard some noise, some commotion going on in the other room. So I came out to see what was happening. George and David Smith were lying in pools of their own blood, and my other friend, David Wyke, was tied up and gagged in the corner. So I frantically called down to the front desk to report a robbery. So they sent the police. The police came up, they looked around, they took our statements. They decided that there hadn't been a robbery, that the Smith brothers had their golden watches, the room was in a nice tidy order, they didn't look like there'd been a struggle, and they said that mine and David Wyke's story didn't match. They thought we were the killers. Let me tell you, I was 83 years old at the time. I was one of the wealthiest men in Connecticut. Do I look like a killer to you? Well, the police's story was that I swindled the Smith brothers out of their life savings, and when they realized it when we got to Muskogee, they confronted me and I shot them and killed them in the hotel. And they also said they found George's diamond ring in my suitcase, but I don't know how it got there. So the police have us arrested, and they're holding us for a few days, and eventually some witnesses came forward and said they had saw some men who matched the description of my friend John Wick's story. So in the end, the prosecutor let us go. And to this day, there has never been enough evidence to convict anyone of this crime. But you believe me, don't you? Thank you. Enjoy the tour.
Thank you. Welcome. Hi, I'm Ruth Heline. I was the first woman from Washington to enlist in the military when America joined the war. It was 1918 and I was 20, and I joined the Navy. And I was stationed in Bridgeport as an ordnance inspector, checking the ammunition. I was nervous because it was big work with the ammunition. And excited because I was like the only woman in the Navy at the time. So, and then I was promoted and moved to Naval Headquarters in New York City, where I was yeoman first class, and I was in the middle of everything. And from there, we helped the men, win the war. We had victory in Europe, and we won World War I. From there I moved. I was in Los Angeles and New Haven, and I was a stenographer for the government. And then I returned to Washington, and I cared for my ailing father. In 1959, I was passenger and I was in a very bad car accident on Upper Churchill Road, not far from my home on the Heline farm. And I died. I was 61 years old. I never married and I didn't have children. So I thank you for coming and visiting me. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. Let me introduce myself.
I'm Hiram Paulding Bellinger. I'm a retired mining engineer, and I was born in August of 1865 in northern New York State. And I'm here to tell you about the fateful day when I was consumed by a fire that burned my house to the ground in November of 1934. The firefighters found my headless body in the smoldering ruins of the house, which was located just through those trees over there across from St. John's Church. My wife Elizabeth and I spent our summers at the stately home, which was built by her father, Rossiter Raymond, back in the 1880s. But just a week prior to my death, we had taken up residence in New Haven at the home of our son, Alfred, who's a professor at Yale University. But I had traveled back up to the house for the weekend by myself, and the last thing I remember was settling down with a book to read before going to bed. Apparently the next-door neighbor, Mrs. Snow, awoke early the next morning to the sound of the crackling flames which had breached the walls of the house and engulfed my front porch, and she called for help. Reverend Tompkins and his son tried to enter the house to search for me, but the whole place was ablaze before they could get inside. The fire swept through the entire house, destroying my family's extensive library and fine collection of antiques before reaching the third-floor bedroom at the back of the house where I slept. I was still wearing my clothes when they found my body, so the investigators suspect that I may have been asphyxiated by furnace gases and lost consciousness before the fire even started, and that perhaps a gas leak is what started the blaze in the first place. But that still doesn't explain my missing head. The police apparently searched for it for several days but never found a trace. Have any of you seen it? Well, thank you very much for stopping to hear my story, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Anyway, my name is William Foulois, and I'm resting here next to my wife, Maud. And I'll start by telling you that my father came here into the depot from France in 1879, and he started a plumbing business. And when my brother and I were old enough, we worked for him. And then later on, I ran the business right up until August of 1955. And well, that was the end of everything for us. I don't know, do any of you know what happened in August of 1955?
The flood.
Well, there were two of them, actually. Oh. August 7th, Hurricane Connie came through the area and dropped 8 inches of rain like in one day with a lot of wind, and it was August, and there were a lot of leaves on the trees, so we lost a lot of trees and branches and everything. And we barely recovered from that. And less than 2 weeks later, Hurricane Diane came through the area with much more rain. Not as much wind, but much more rain. It poured. It started raining at noon that day, and by 7 o'clock that night there was 2 feet of water on Main Street. And that's where our house was. Well, you know, the fire whistles went off, and the civil defense people came around, and they wanted everybody to evacuate. We decided to stay, you know. We thought it was just going to be a flood, and we had been through floods before. Well, hardly got any sleep that night. The house was creaking and groaning, and the rain was pounding down on the roof. By the next morning, the water was halfway up the window on the first floor. So the fire department came around in boats this time with ropes and pulleys and whatnot. They wanted to rescue us. And we thought it was silly because by then it had stopped raining and it looked like the sun was going to come out. So we just decided to stay where we were. We didn't know what was going to happen next, though. You see, up on the Chepaug River, all the culverts were all clogged up with debris. Leaves and mud and stones and branches and whatnot. And the water level kept getting deeper and deeper and deeper. And finally it got so deep that the dam just exploded. So there was a 6-foot wall of water and mud and debris came rushing down toward the town. Well, we were huddled up on the second floor, and all of a sudden something big and powerful just hit the house, and it knocked the whole house off the foundation. It carried us downstream. Oh, it was terrifying. You know, the house crashed into the Moody Bridge. That was the last thing I remembered. Well, the house exploded and completely destroyed. The bridge was completely destroyed. Maud and I were thrown into the river and, well, we both drowned. Well, that flood changed the town that day, and, you know, as it turned out, we were the only 2 fatalities. But our friends and neighbors rebuilt the town, put a lot of work into it, and the result is what the town is that you see here today. So anyway, well, thanks for coming by and listening to my story, and have a good night. And please be safe. Please be safe.
Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Dr. Benjamin Tenney, Jr. I'm originally from Boston, where my father was a doctor. As a child, I admired him greatly, and I wanted to grow up and be just like him. Well, by the time I graduated high school in 1917, I was all caught up in the excitement of the war, and I wanted to enlist. My parents tried to convince me otherwise, but eventually we compromised, and I joined the Norton Hodges Ambulance Corps and drove an ambulance at the age of 17 for the French Army. And my parents thought I'd be safe. But we were right on the front lines, treating the wounded soldiers. We had some close calls. And it was a gruesome experience that I'll never forget. But soon, the U.S. military joined the war, and I was sent home, where the Red Cross took over ambulance services, and I went to school and I became an obstetrician. I couldn't stay away from the military, though. I was eventually appointed as a Rear Admiral with the Navy, where I served in the Pacific in World War II while practicing and teaching in Boston. I eventually retired in 1964, and I lived a quiet life on Nichols Hill Road until my death in 1984. Thank you for listening to my story.
Good evening. I'm Ann Sheafe Miller, and I became famous for not dying. In 1942 of March, I became seriously ill with a streptococcal infection. I was in New Haven Hospital for almost a month. Delirious, temperatures of up to 107 degrees. Can you imagine? 107 degrees. They basically told my family I was at death's door. In one last attempt to save my life, they decided to inject me with an experimental unknown drug to try to save my life. And this medicine was known as penicillin. My medical charts, you can still see them as the Smithsonian Institute, and they'll tell you of my progress, how after the injection, next day, my temperature went down and I became much better. Due to the miracle of my recovery, the pharmaceutical companies started mass production of penicillin. This wonder drug saved millions and millions of lives. And to think I was the very first person to get this injection. Amazing, isn't it? Me.
Wow.
Thank you very much.
Welcome to my tent. I'm William McNally. I survived the Civil War, but am feeling nostalgic tonight about my war experience. I was born in Ireland in 1831. I emigrated to America when I was rather young. I eventually made Washington my home, and was among the men of Washington moved by Lincoln's call to defend the Union. I enlisted and was mustered into Company D of the 28th Infantry Volunteers for 9 months of service. Camp life sometimes was as dull as farming. As you can see, my tent was rather humble, but it offered protection against the elements. Typically, as many as 3 men would fit in a single tent, which is tight but cozy on cold nights. We had minimal home furnishings since we had to keep as light a load as possible so we could pack and transport the camp easily. We often used a trunk or a box as a table or writing desk. We had other basics like writing material, candles, and playing cards for entertainment. We had tobacco and pipes if you were a smoker. We had other supplies for more exciting times like battle. I always wanted this by my side when I went into battle. It was important to keep our gunpowder dry, or we were in big trouble when we had to return fire on an enemy. I also, since I was inventory, carried a sword. Some men had knives or daggers, which came in handy in hand-to-hand combat. After the war, I returned to civilian life to live with my wife, Anna, and 2 boys, Edward and George. Thank you for letting me share some part of my memories. It was a perfect night. Take care. Enjoy the evening.
Thank you. Iceberg, right ahead. The events of that night, April 15th, 1912, forever changed my life. My good friend Alex Compton and I attended the gunnery school in 1895. Years after graduating, we met again in England, and both our families had scheduled a trip back to America aboard the SS Titanic. We thought it'd be a great trip, and we were together constantly during the voyage. Then one night, we were all sitting together, enjoying cigars in the smoke room, when we felt a long, scraping sound along the side of the ship, just as if the ship had lightly touched a piece of floating wreckage. Then someone came in and said that Titanic had just hit an iceberg. Well, being so curious, we decided to go up on deck and investigate. Well, once we were up there, we realized there's no reason for concern. I mean, after all, this is the Titanic, and it is unsinkable. So it was a very cold night, so we decided to return to our staterooms. Just then, my room steward whispered to me, the mailroom, just 2 flights below, was flooding. Well, I quickly ran down to my family, and we put on our life belts and raced up to the upper deck. I even joked with my friend Alex. I said, you know, they're only putting us in the lifeboats as a precaution, and that we'd be back in an hour or 2 and in our staterooms, and we'd all have colds as well. Well, as I was putting my family back into the lifeboat, I turned and motioned to Alex to follow us. He nodded, and then he took his mother's arm, and along with his sister, they followed us. But that was the last time I saw him. He must have been unwilling to put his aged mother in an open lifeboat until the very last minute. He probably hesitated, and during the mass confusion, he realized that all of a sudden there was no room in any of the lifeboats for him. I believe he went down with the ship, silent and uncomplaining, his duty done. And he never would have survived that freezing cold water. I believe Alex died just like he had lived, as a man. Even today, you can see the monument we built to Alex right next to the athletic field at the gunnery school. Please go see it, and never forget my dear friend Alex Compton, who was lost with 1,500 other souls that went down with the Titanic in the North Ocean on that terrible, terrible night. Thank you all for coming. I'm so glad just to be here with you tonight. Thank you so much.